By August of 1941, a small group of German staff officers sat down to update a number. It should have been a simple exercise. Count the Soviet divisions destroyed. Subtract them from the total the army believed it was facing. Watch the Soviet Union run out of soldiers. Instead, they found something that did not make sense. The Russian colossus had been underestimated by us. At the start of the war, we reckoned with about 200 enemy divisions. Now we have already counted 360. When a dozen have been smashed, then the Russian puts up another dozen. Read that again slowly, because it is the strangest sentence to come out of a headquarters that had, only weeks earlier, been celebrating one of the most successful invasions in military history. The man who wrote it was not a pessimist. He was not some junior officer prone to panic. He was General Franz Halder, chief of the German Army General Staff, one of the most experienced planners in Europe, a man who had helped design the campaigns that conquered Poland, France, and the Low Countries in a matter of weeks. And here he was, less than 2 months into the invasion of the Soviet Union, admitting that the entire foundation of the plan had been wrong. Not wrong by a little, wrong by nearly double. This documentary is about that gap. Not the gap between 200 divisions and 360, although that number matters enormously. It is about the much larger gap between what German planners believed the Soviet Union could do and what the Soviet Union actually turned out to be capable of doing. Because here is the uncomfortable truth for anyone trying to understand 1941. The men who made this mistake were not fools. They were some of the most capable military professionals on the planet. They had access to intelligence services, aerial reconnaissance, diplomatic reporting, and years of study on the Soviet military. And they still got it catastrophically wrong. So the real question is not simply what happened. It is how an army with this much expertise convinced itself that a nation of nearly 200 million people spread across 11 time zones could be knocked out of the war in a single summer. To answer that, we have to go back before the tanks crossed the border. Because the seeds of this miscalculation were planted years earlier in courtrooms, in propaganda offices, in diplomatic cables, and in the assumptions people carry when they desperately want something to be true. By the summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler controlled more of Europe than any German leader in history. France had fallen in 6 weeks. Poland had fallen in weeks before that. Denmark and Norway had been overrun. The Low Countries had folded almost as quickly. There was a pattern here, and German commanders had noticed it. Fast, concentrated armored thrusts, supported by air power, could unbalance an enemy before it had time to organize a coherent defense. It had worked again and again. Why would it not work a third time? The Soviet Union, on paper, looked like an even more tempting target than France had been. Stalin's regime had spent the previous 4 years tearing through its own officer corps in a series of political purges. Thousands of experienced commanders, including a large share of the senior leadership, had been arrested, executed, or removed from their positions between 1937 and 1938. German intelligence knew about this. It was not a secret. Diplomats, journalists, and military attaches had all reported on the scale of the purges, and German analysts drew what seemed like a reasonable conclusion. An army that has just gutted its own leadership cannot possibly fight at full effectiveness. Then came the Winter War. In late 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland, a country with a fraction of its population and resources. The campaign was supposed to be a formality. Instead, Finnish forces inflicted embarrassing losses on the Red Army for months before Soviet numbers finally overwhelmed them. To outside observers, this looked like confirmation. The Red Army was clumsy, poorly led, and struggled even against a small neighboring country. If it could not defeat Finland quickly, how could it possibly withstand the same blitzkrieg machine that had flattened France? This is the point where we need to pause and be honest about something. This was not a crazy conclusion to reach. It was based on real, observable events. The purges had happened. The Winter War had happened. The problems visible in 1939 were, in many respects, genuinely real problems. The mistake was not in observing these weaknesses. The mistake was in assuming they represented the complete picture, rather than a snapshot of an army in the middle of reorganizing itself. because the Soviet leadership had also watched the Winter War and had not liked what it saw either. In the months that followed, the Red Army carried out significant reforms. Command structures were adjusted. New equipment programs were accelerated, including tanks that would soon become deeply unwelcome surprises for German crews. None of this was invisible. Some of it was even reported, but it did not fit the narrative that German planners had already settled into. And this is where ideology starts to matter just as much as intelligence reports. Nazi ideology did not view the Soviet Union as simply another great power to be respected and cautiously assessed. It viewed the peoples of the Soviet Union through a racial hierarchy that considered Slavic populations inherently inferior and considered the Soviet state itself a fragile, almost artificial structure propped up by a small layer of supposedly Jewish Bolshevik leadership. Hitler told the German high command that their armies would shatter the Russian colossus. Notice the word he chose, colossus, a giant. Something enormous, but also in the way Hitler used it, something hollow. Something that looked powerful on the outside while being rotten underneath. That single image of a huge but brittle structure that would collapse the moment it was struck hard enough shaped an enormous amount of German planning. It gave military calculations a kind of ideological permission slip. If the enemy was inherently weak by nature, then any inconvenient data suggesting otherwise could be waved away as temporary or exaggerated. This is one of the most important lessons buried in this entire story. Bad intelligence is dangerous. Bad intelligence filtered through a belief system that already knows the answer it wants is far more dangerous because it stops being corrected. So by the spring of 1941, German planners sat down to build an invasion plan around a specific set of assumptions. The Soviet military was large in raw numbers, but poorly led, poorly equipped in modern terms, and structurally fragile. A series of fast, deep armored envelopments could trap and destroy the bulk of Soviet forces near the border. And once that force was gone, the state behind it would not have the capacity, or perhaps even the will, to rebuild. Another factor in their calculations was purely political. German planners believed that within 3 to 6 months of their invasion, the Soviet regime would collapse from lack of domestic support. Read that carefully. This was not just a military prediction. It was a political prediction layered on top of the military one. Even if the Red Army somehow survived the initial blow, the assumption was that Stalin's government itself might simply crack under the pressure. Two separate bets, both resting on the same underlying belief, that the Soviet Union, whatever its size on a map, was fundamentally weaker underneath than it appeared. Now let's talk about the plan itself, because understanding why it looked reasonable is essential before we can understand why it failed. For the campaign, the Germans allotted almost 150 divisions containing a total of about 3 million men, including 19 panzer divisions, roughly 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,500 aircraft. On paper, this looked staggering. It was, in raw terms, the largest invasion force ever assembled. 3 army groups would drive east along a front stretching close to 2,000 miles from the Baltic in the north to the Black Sea in the south. Army Group North would push toward Leningrad. Army Group Center, the strongest of the 3, would drive through Belarus towards Smolensk and eventually Moscow. Army Group South would advance into Ukraine, toward Kiev and the industrial regions beyond it. The plan called for a series of encirclements. German panzer forces would punch through weak points, race ahead, and link up behind large formations of Soviet troops before those troops could retreat. Trapped, cut off from supplies, surrounded on all sides, these Soviet armies would then be destroyed or forced to surrender. It had worked in Poland. It had worked in France. Why would the largest country on earth be any different? Here is why that question matters so much. Every previous German campaign had taken place within a relatively compact geographic space. France is roughly the size of Texas. Poland is smaller still. An army could drive from one end of these countries to the other within days, and once the enemy's main force was destroyed, there was very little space left in which to keep fighting. The Soviet Union did not work this way, and this is where the hidden problem begins to reveal itself. Even German intelligence estimates before the invasion had assumed the Soviet Union possessed something in the range of 200 combat divisions. If a large share of those divisions could be trapped and destroyed near the western border, in Belarus and Ukraine, then the road to Moscow and beyond would supposedly stand open. But 200 divisions was never the true ceiling of Soviet military potential. It was closer to a snapshot of what the Soviet Union had already mobilized and positioned near its western frontier at that particular moment. Facing off against the invasion, the Red Army numbered some 5.5 million men, and Soviet mobilization was not finished by a long shot. Soon, there would be more than 14 million men and women called up for the war against the Germans. Sit with that gap for a moment. 5.5 million already under arms when the invasion began. 14 million more to eventually follow. German planning had been built around defeating the smaller of those two numbers, in the belief that doing so would be enough to end the war. This was not a minor miscalculation. It was closer to preparing for a boxing match while believing your opponent only had one arm. So why did nobody catch this before June? Partly because Soviet mobilization capacity is genuinely difficult to observe from the outside. You cannot photograph a factory that has not yet been built, or count reservists who have not yet been called into uniform. German intelligence agencies, particularly the department responsible for assessing Soviet strength, known as Foreign Armies East, worked with the information available to them, and much of the deeper mobilization potential of the Soviet system simply was not visible through conventional means. But partly, and this matters just as much, because nobody wanted to look too hard. If the true scale of Soviet manpower had been fully appreciated, the entire premise of a quick summer campaign would have collapsed before a single tank crossed the border. There is a phrase worth remembering here. It is easier to build a plan around numbers you can verify than around numbers that might ruin the plan if you went looking for them. On the morning of June the 22nd, 1941, the invasion began. The invasion along a nearly 2,000-mile front took the Soviet leadership completely by surprise and caught the Red Army in an unprepared and partially demobilized state. For the first days, everything appeared to confirm exactly what German planners had expected. Soviet air power was devastated on the ground before it ever got airborne. Border defenses buckled almost immediately. Panzer columns tore forward at a pace that startled even their own commanders. Advancing tanks raced 50 miles beyond the frontier on the first day of the invasion and were 200 miles beyond it within days. Imagine being a Soviet officer somewhere in that first week, watching your telephone lines to headquarters go silent, watching columns of tanks appear from directions that supply maps insisted no enemy could reach so quickly. This was not a gradual crisis. It was chaos arriving faster than anyone could process it. By early July, the encirclement pattern German planners had hoped for was already producing enormous results. A giant pincer movement converged on Minsk early in July, and 300,000 prisoners were taken. A week later came the Battle of Smolensk, which raged for 3 weeks and brought 300,000 more prisoners. 600,000 men, captured in a matter of weeks in only 2 of the opening battles. To put that number into perspective, that is more soldiers than several entire European nations fielded in their armies at the time. If you had shown these figures to a room of military analysts anywhere in the world in July of 1941, almost all of them would have told you the same thing. This war was already decided. 11 days after the invasion began, Holder noted in his diary that he was not exaggerating when he said the campaign against Russia was won in 14 days. Read that timeline again. 14 days. Halder, one of the most experienced staff officers in the German army, looked at the opening battles and concluded the war was effectively finished before the end of its second week. This is not a man being reckless. This is a professional looking at the evidence directly in front of him, applying every lesson he had learned from Poland and France, and arriving at a conclusion that seemed entirely rational. But there was a catch. And the catch was not visible yet because it was not happening on any battlefield German commanders could see. While Wehrmacht units were counting prisoners in the hundreds of thousands, something else was happening hundreds of miles to the east, far behind the front lines. German intelligence could observe. Soviet forces reorganized, relocating factories to ramp up production of tanks and aircraft. This detail sounds almost bureaucratic when you first hear it. Factories being moved. It does not sound like the kind of thing that changes the outcome of a war, but think about what it actually required. Entire industrial complexes, machine tools, skilled workers, and their families loaded onto trains and shipped east of the Ural Mountains, far beyond the reach of German bombers or advancing armor. It was chaotic. It was inefficient in the short term. Some of it barely worked at all in the first week, but it meant that the Soviet Union's capacity to build new tanks, new artillery, and new aircraft was not something German forces could simply capture or destroy by advancing further east. It was being physically carried out of reach. At the same time, something else was happening that mattered just as much. The Germans found their advance stymied by a revitalized Soviet spirit, which mobilized millions to replenish its ranks, even amid staggering losses. Here's the mechanism worth understanding clearly. Every time a German encirclement destroyed a Soviet army, that army was not simply erased from the war. In many cases, its designation was reformed, its remaining soldiers folded into new units, and fresh conscripts poured in behind them from a population base that dwarfed anything German planners had built their assumptions around. This is the moment where the phrase Halder would eventually write in his diary starts to make sense in advance. Whenever a dozen divisions were destroyed, the Soviet system generated another dozen to take their place. Not instantly, not without enormous cost in blood and equipment, but persistently, in a way the original plan had never accounted for. There is also a smaller, more specific surprise worth mentioning here, because it captures something important about how German assumptions were built on outdated information. When German tank crews first encountered the Soviet T-34 and the heavier KV-1, they discovered vehicles that, in armor and firepower, were in some respects superior to anything currently in German service. Standard German anti-tank guns of the period often struggled to penetrate their frontal armor at normal combat ranges. This was not supposed to happen. German pre-war assessments of Soviet armor had focused heavily on older, less capable tank designs that made up the bulk of what intelligence services had actually observed and cataloged. The newest Soviet designs had entered production quietly, and in numbers few outside observers had anticipated. None of this alone would have doomed the campaign. German forces adapted, as they had throughout the war, developing tactics and eventually new weapons to counter these tanks. But it was one more thread in a growing pattern. Piece by piece, the actual capabilities of the Soviet Union kept turning out to be larger, deeper, and more resilient than the intelligence picture had suggested. By the end of July, something strange was happening inside German headquarters. The victories kept coming. The prisoner counts kept climbing. And yet the war did not feel like it was ending. This is where the human dimension of the story becomes impossible to ignore. German soldiers on the ground were, by most accounts, exhausted in a way that pure map distances do not capture. They had advanced further and faster than any army in the war so far, across roads that were often unpaved, through summer heat that turned dust into a constant physical hazard for engines and lungs alike. Fuel convoys struggled to keep pace with panzer spearheads racing ahead of them. Soviet railway gauge was wider than the gauge used across the rest of Europe, meaning captured rail lines could not simply be used by German trains without being physically reworked first. Every mile gained was also a mile the supply system now had to stretch across. None of this was invisible to German commanders. Many of them had raised concerns about logistics before the invasion even began. But raising a concern and having the political and strategic freedom to act on it are two very different things, especially when the campaign's opening weeks appeared to be validating every optimistic assumption. And this is where a deeper argument, one that had been simmering for years, finally boiled over inside the German high command. Hitler and his senior generals had never fully agreed on what the primary objective of the campaign should even be. Some, including Halder, believed Moscow was the decisive target. As the political, industrial, and transportation heart of the Soviet Union, capturing it might fatally disrupt the entire Soviet war effort in one blow. Hitler disagreed, at least for a critical stretch of the summer. He placed enormous importance on the economic resources of Ukraine, its grain and industry, and on securing the flanks of the advance, before pushing further toward the Soviet capital. Much of August was wasted while Hitler and his advisors were having long arguments as to what course they should follow after their initial victories. Picture what this actually meant in practice. Some of the most mobile, most experienced armored formations in the German army, Forces that had spent the summer punching through Soviet defenses at extraordinary speed spent weeks essentially idling while their commanders argued about where they should be sent next. Eventually, Hitler's preference won out, at least temporarily. Significant panzer forces were redirected south, away from the direct route toward Moscow, to support a massive encirclement operation around Kiev. In purely tactical terms, the result was staggering. The battle around Kiev produced one of the largest encirclements in military history, trapping enormous numbers of Soviet troops and further devastating Soviet forces in Ukraine. Judged purely by the metrics German planners had always used, prisoners captured, territory seized, enemy formations destroyed, it was an overwhelming success. But here is the irony sitting quietly underneath that victory. Every week, those panzer divisions spent driving south, encircling Kiev, and then repositioning back toward the central front was a week that was not spent driving toward Moscow. And Moscow was not simply waiting patiently for them to arrive. While German forces were achieving their triumph in Ukraine, autumn was approaching in the north and center. And autumn, on the roads of the Soviet Union, brought a problem that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with something far more basic: rain. The seasonal thaw known by Soviet troops as the Rasputitsa turned the region's dirt roads into thick, clinging mud capable of swallowing trucks up to their axles. Wheeled supply vehicles bogged down. Even tracked vehicles struggled. An army that depended on speed to compensate for its numerical inferiority in raw manpower was now moving at a crawl, exactly when time had become its scarcest resource. This is the moment worth pausing on, because it captures the entire tragedy of the German miscalculation in a single image. An invasion built around the assumption of a short campaign was now, in October, only just approaching what many commanders still believed could be a decisive final push toward Moscow. The calendar that had once seemed generous now felt suffocatingly tight. And behind all of this sat the number. Nobody in German high command wanted to say out loud yet, but that Halder was about to put into words that August. The Russian colossus had been underestimated by us. At the start of the war, we reckoned with about 200 enemy divisions. Now we have already counted 360. When a dozen have been smashed, then the Russian puts up another dozen. This is worth returning to now, because by the time Halder wrote it, its implications had already started reshaping the entire campaign, even before Moscow's fate was decided. Notice something important about the arithmetic here. German forces had not failed to win battles. They had won an extraordinary number of them. The problem was not battlefield performance in the tactical sense. The problem was that the underlying premise, the size of the enemy they believed they were fighting, had been fundamentally wrong from the very beginning. Hitler and his propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, admitted that they had obviously underestimated completely Soviet striking power and, above all, the equipment of the Soviet Union. That is a remarkable admission to find in the private record of a regime that spent enormous energy projecting confidence and inevitability to its own public. Behind closed doors, the men running the invasion were beginning to grasp that the entire strategic premise underneath Barbarossa might be broken. They were forced to realize that Stalin's increasingly efficient regime had succeeded in creating an untouchable Eastern industrial base which enabled his armies to keep receiving new equipment. Even as the war ground on and the original Western Soviet industrial regions fell into German hands. Untouchable is the key word there. The relocation of factories east of the Urals. The very thing dismissed months earlier as a chaotic administrative footnote, had turned into something German bombers and panzer divisions simply could not reach. There is a bitter irony buried in this. Germany had built its entire invasion around destroying the Soviet Union's existing military and industrial base as quickly as possible. But by moving critical production capacity beyond the invasion's reach early enough, the Soviet system had essentially removed the one lever German planners had counted on pulling. Meanwhile, the earlier estimate of Soviet military potential, that figure of roughly 200 divisions, had proven to be closer to a floor than a ceiling. And that gap between 200 and 360 divisions was not simply an intelligence embarrassment buried in a diary entry. It represented, in very concrete terms, an entire additional army group's worth of enemy soldiers that German logistics, fuel supplies, and replacement systems had never been designed to fight. This is worth connecting back to that earlier pre-war assumption, because the contrast is almost unbearable in hindsight. German pre-war planning had estimated something like 240 destroyed Soviet divisions, with only 60 remaining intact. And with such an overwhelming margin of victory, planners the Soviet Union could never recover. During the actual campaign, the Germans really did destroy something close to that number, roughly 248 divisions. But due to Soviet mobilization, there were an additional 220 divisions remaining, far more than the expected 60. Read those two numbers side by side. German planners believed that destroying most of the Soviet army would leave behind a rump force of perhaps 60 divisions, too small to matter. In practice, even after achieving nearly the exact scale of destruction they had planned for, more than 3 times that many fresh divisions stood in the way. This is not a story about German soldiers failing to fight well, or German commanders failing to win battles. This is a story about an entire strategic framework built on a number that was simply wrong, and wrong in a direction that made every subsequent success feel less decisive than it should have. Imagine spending your entire retirement savings assuming your opponent had a fixed, limited amount of money to spend against you, only to discover partway through that they had access to a line of credit you never knew existed. Every dollar you spent to gain ground was matched and then some by resources you had never budgeted for. That is roughly what German planners were discovering, division by division, through the late summer and into the autumn of 1941. So why, once this realization had set in, did the German High Command not simply pause, reassess, and adjust the entire strategy? Some of the reasons were structural. An invasion involving millions of men, spread across a front nearly 2,000 miles wide, cannot simply stop and reorganize overnight. Fuel had already been allocated. Rail schedules had already been built around specific objectives. Entire army groups had already been positioned based on assumptions made months earlier. Some of the reasons were political. Admitting that the fundamental premise behind Barbarossa was flawed would have meant admitting failure at the highest levels of a regime whose entire public identity was built around inevitability and strength. That kind of admission does not happen easily inside authoritarian systems, where bad news often travels upward more slowly and more cautiously than good news. And some of the reasons were simply psychological. When you have already invested enormous resources into a plan, and that plan has produced genuinely spectacular tactical results, it becomes very difficult to accept that the underlying strategy might still be broken. The victories themselves became a kind of evidence against changing course, even as the deeper numbers argued the opposite. So the invasion continued, now aimed squarely at Moscow in an operation the Germans called Typhoon, launched in the first days of October. In October, the Wehrmacht launched Operation Typhoon, the effort to take Moscow and end the war by Christmas. Notice that phrase, by Christmas. Nearly 4 months into a campaign that had originally been expected to conclude within weeks, German planners were still working from a mental calendar that assumed decisive victory remained just barely within reach. If only the next push succeeded. The early weeks of Typhoon produced yet another round of encirclements, trapping large Soviet forces near Vyazma and Bryansk. On paper, the road to Moscow looked open once again. And once again, German commanders allowed themselves to believe the decisive moment had finally arrived. But by now, the Rasputitsa mud had given way to something worse. Temperatures began dropping toward the kind of cold that German equipment, uniforms, and vehicles had never been designed to endure through an extended campaign. Because nobody in the original planning had expected the army to still be fighting this far east once winter set in. The winter of 1941 to 1942 hit German troops especially hard. They lacked winter gear and supplies. Frostbite and disease killed thousands before they even saw combat. Sit with the absurdity of that sentence for a moment. Soldiers who had survived encirclement battles, artillery barrages, and months of continuous combat were now being taken out of the fight by cold weather. Because supply planners back in Germany had never seriously prepared for the possibility that this campaign would still be underway in December. This was not an accident of bad luck. It was a direct mechanical consequence of the original assumption that the war would be over long before winter mattered. Warm coats, Insulated boots and antifreeze suited for extreme cold are not items an army simply improvises in the field. They are items that must be planned, manufactured, and shipped months in advance based on an accurate estimate of how long the campaign will actually last. Every miscalculation about Soviet strength, every week lost arguing over Kiev versus Moscow, every month spent underestimating how many fresh divisions Stalin could still field, eventually arrived at this single, almost absurdly mundane point of failure: men freezing in summer uniforms outside a city they had once expected to capture in weeks. And then on the 6th of December, the strategic picture inverted completely. The Soviet counteroffensive kicked off on December 6, 1941, with fresh Siberian divisions attacking exhausted German positions. Those Siberian divisions deserve a moment of explanation because they represent, almost perfectly, everything German intelligence had failed to account for months earlier. Soviet commanders, aware that Japan was unlikely to open a second front in the Far East that winter, had quietly begun shifting well-equipped, cold-weather-trained divisions from Siberia toward the fight outside Moscow. This was precisely the kind of hidden reserve capacity that German planning had never seriously priced into its calculations, not because it was impossible to imagine, but because acknowledging it would have meant admitting the 200-division estimate was never going to be the whole picture. General Georgy Zhukov led the counterattack with roughly 100 divisions, and Soviet troops advanced 60 to 150 miles in some places. German forces, exhausted, frostbitten, and stretched to their logistical limit, were pushed backward from the outskirts of Moscow in a way that had not happened to the German army at any point earlier in the war. This was not a controlled tactical withdrawal. This was the invading army being forced for the first time to retreat. German troops retreated for the first time in the war. Let that sink in for a moment, because it is easy to skim past a sentence like that without fully appreciating its weight. This was an army that had spent 2 years being told by its own propaganda and by its own remarkable early successes that it did not retreat. That belief now had to confront reality directly outside the gates of the enemy's capital. None of this means the war on the Eastern Front was decided in December of 1941. It was not. Stalingrad still lay a year in the future. Kursk lay further still. The war would grind on for nearly 4 more years through immense suffering on every side. But something had already changed in a way that could not be undone. The fundamental premise behind Barbarossa, that the Soviet Union could be knocked out of the war within a single summer through a series of decisive encirclements, had been tested against reality and had failed. The war on the Eastern Front turned into a battle of attrition, and Germany couldn't keep up with the prolonged fighting. This is the phrase worth sitting with as we start pulling back to the larger picture. A battle of attrition. That is precisely the kind of war German planning had been built to avoid, because German industrial capacity, however impressive, was never going to be able to match Soviet mobilization and production once that production had been safely relocated beyond the reach of German bombers. Soviet casualties stayed high, but they had more reserves than Germany, and the Red Army replaced losses faster than the Germans could. That single sentence contains almost the entire strategic argument of this documentary. It was never really a question of who fought better in any single battle. In many individual engagements, German forces demonstrated superior tactics, coordination, and equipment. It was a question of who could keep fighting once the initial advantages had been spent. So, let's step back now and ask the harder question underneath all of this. Why did an army staffed with genuinely skilled professionals, supported by a functioning intelligence apparatus, walk into a war against an opponent it had so badly misjudged? The easy answer is to say the Germans underestimated Soviet numbers. That is true, but it is incomplete because it treats this as a simple counting error, like a clerk misreading a spreadsheet. The reality involves several separate failures stacking on top of each other, each one reinforcing the others. The first failure was ideological. Nazi racial theory did not merely coexist alongside military planning. It actively shaped how intelligence was interpreted. A regime that viewed Slavic peoples and the Soviet system as inherently inferior was always going to be inclined to interpret ambiguous evidence in the direction that confirmed Soviet weakness, rather than Soviet resilience. The second failure was informational. Soviet mobilization capacity, industrial relocation potential, and reserve manpower were genuinely difficult to observe from the outside, especially under the totalitarian secrecy Stalin's government maintained. German intelligence was not simply lazy. It was working with real limitations in what could be seen and verified before the invasion began. The third failure was historical pattern matching. German commanders had every reason, based on recent experience, to believe that fast armored operations could decisively defeat a numerically larger opponent. Poland and France had validated that belief spectacularly. Nobody involved had direct experience of what happens when that same operational method meets a country with the geographic depth and population reserves of the Soviet Union. The fourth failure was institutional. Once the invasion began producing genuinely impressive tactical victories, there was enormous pressure, both political and psychological, to interpret those victories as proof that the original strategic assumptions were correct, rather than as evidence that needed to be weighed against the growing signs of Soviet resilience appearing elsewhere. And the fifth failure, perhaps the most human of all, was simple wishful thinking under time pressure. A short, decisive war against the Soviet Union solved enormous problems for German strategic planning, avoiding a prolonged two-front conflict and securing resources needed for the wider war. That need for a short war made the assumption of a short war more attractive to believe, regardless of how solid the underlying evidence actually was. None of these 5 failures alone would necessarily have doomed the campaign. Ideological blinders alone might have been partially corrected by good intelligence. Informational gaps alone might have been partially offset by cautious planning that built in margin for error. But when ideology, imperfect intelligence, historical overconfidence, institutional pressure, and wishful thinking all pointed in the same direction at the same time, the result was not simply an error. It was a system almost perfectly designed to avoid noticing its own mistake until it was already deep inside the country it had underestimated. Historians continue to debate exactly how much weight to assign to each of these factors, and that debate is unlikely to ever fully resolve. Because the German invasion of the Soviet Union involved so many overlapping decisions made by different people with different levels of information at different moments, some emphasize the ideological blindness at the top. Others emphasize the genuine intelligence limitations facing foreign armies east. Still others point to Hitler's personal interference in operational decisions, particularly the argument over Kiev versus Moscow, as the moment that turned a difficult campaign into an unrecoverable one. What almost all serious historical accounts agree on, however, is that no single explanation on its own fully accounts for what happened. It was not simply bad intelligence. It was not simply Hitler's political interference. It was not simply the Russian winter, despite how often that explanation gets repeated in popular retellings. It is worth addressing that popular explanation directly, because it deserves some scrutiny. Winter certainly hurt German forces badly, arriving without adequate cold weather equipment and freezing men who should have been resupplied months earlier. But winter did not create the underlying problem. It merely arrived at the exact moment the underlying problem, chronic underestimation of Soviet reserves and industrial capacity, had already stretched German forces to their absolute limit. If the Germans had somehow correctly estimated Soviet strength from the beginning, the campaign's entire structure would likely have looked completely different. Perhaps a more limited set of objectives. Perhaps a slower, more cautious advance that preserved logistics rather than sprinting ahead of them. Perhaps a fundamentally different political decision about whether to launch the invasion at all in 1941, rather than waiting and building greater strength first. That last possibility deserves a moment of counterfactual consideration, because it is the closest thing to a genuine alternative that existed. Some officers, before the invasion, quietly worried that Germany's economy could not sustain a prolonged, multi-year war against an opponent of the Soviet Union size, and argued for waiting and building greater reserves before attacking. But this alternative carried its own serious risks. Every year of delay gave the Soviet Union more time to rearm, reorganize its officer corps following the purges, and continue expanding its own industrial base. From a certain angle, waiting might have made the eventual challenge even larger rather than smaller. There was no comfortable option sitting quietly on the table waiting to be chosen. This is part of what makes this story genuinely difficult, rather than simply a story about incompetence. The men making these decisions were not choosing between an obviously good plan and an obviously bad one. They were choosing between several deeply uncertain paths, using intelligence that was incomplete by nature, filtered through beliefs that made some conclusions feel more comfortable than others. There is also something worth saying about how this story is often told after the fact, because hindsight tends to flatten complicated decisions into simple mistakes. It is tempting, looking backward from 1945, to say the Germans should have known better. They had access to information about Soviet industrial capacity. They had reports on Soviet mobilization potential. Surely, with better analysis, they could have seen this coming. But intelligence assessment rarely works with the clarity hindsight provides. Every scrap of information German analysts received in 1940 and 1941 arrived mixed together with contradictory signals, incomplete data, and deliberate Soviet secrecy. Picking out the correct pattern from that noise, especially when your own leadership already had a strong preference for a particular answer, is far harder in the moment than it appears decades later with the outcome already known. This is not an argument that German planners were blameless. Some of their errors were genuinely avoidable, particularly the extent to which ideological assumptions about Soviet inferiority were allowed to override cautious military analysis. But it is an argument for understanding this as a failure born from a combination of real informational limits and self-reinforcing overconfidence rather than a simple stupidity. So what did this underestimation ultimately cost beyond the immediate failure to capture Moscow before winter? The strategic consequences rippled outward for years. A war that German planning had assumed would be finished within months instead became a grinding, multi-year conflict on a front that consumed a staggering share of German manpower, fuel, and industrial output for the remainder of the war. Every subsequent major German operation on the Eastern Front, including the following year's push toward Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields, was conducted by an army that had never fully recovered the margin of superiority it possessed in the summer of 1941. Losses in men, in trained officers, in irreplaceable equipment, all compounded from a starting point that had already been undermined by the original miscalculation about Soviet strength. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union used the time bought by its own resilience, however costly, to continue building the industrial machine that would eventually allow it to outproduce Germany in tanks, artillery, and aircraft for the remainder of the war. That relocated industrial base, dismissed as a bureaucratic footnote in the summer of 1941, became one of the decisive material foundations of the Soviet Union's eventual victory on the Eastern Front. There is a version of this story that reduces everything to a single, satisfying line. Germany lost because it underestimated the Soviet Union. That sentence is true, but it is also almost too simple to be genuinely useful because it treats the underestimation as a single event, rather than as an accumulating series of decisions. The real picture looks more like this. Ideology shaped intelligence. Intelligence shaped planning. Planning shaped how much margin for error the campaign carried. Early tactical success reinforced the original assumptions, even as contradictory evidence quietly accumulated in the background. Political interference over strategic priorities cost precious weeks at exactly the moment those weeks mattered most. Weather arrived on schedule, indifferent to how badly it was needed to hold off a little longer. And an opponent whose reserves had been badly miscounted kept generating new divisions, right up until those divisions were strong enough to push back. No single piece of that chain on its own guarantees the outcome we already know happened. Remove any one link. Better intelligence. A different decision over Kiev, warmer uniforms shipped a month earlier. And it becomes genuinely difficult to say with confidence exactly how the following winter would have unfolded. That uncertainty is not a weakness in this story. It is the entire point of it. Because the truest answer to the question posed by this documentary's title is not that Germany made one catastrophic error in judging Soviet capacity. It is that Germany built an entire strategic framework and staked the future of the war in the East upon it, using an estimate that was flawed from the start, and then spent the following months discovering, division by division, mile by mile, and finally degree by degree as winter closed in, exactly how much larger the real number had always been.